The lecture is about a discussion of what craft might mean in a digital era. As you heard, I'm an architectural historian, but I'm very interested in the history of ideas, and this lecture will also deal with the history of the idea of craft as well as digitalization. In the end, I will open up for a discussion of this subject, what it might mean for the project of BuildDigiCraft. There is also a subtitle, A Search for Earthly Paradise, which I'll try to explain soon. I could start with a quote from Peter Davies, who wrote a very good book on arts and crafts architecture in England, published in 1980. Later on, for a long time, Peter Davies was the editor of Architectural Review, and he really tried to implement these ideas in his way of running the magazine about contemporary architecture. There is a quote in the end saying that William Morris would surely have welcomed the microchip, which I think is very suitable to this lecture. What Peter Davies means by that is that William Morris, living in the mid-19th century, saw the backside of industrialization, and he would surely have welcomed any way of making the situation of the workers in the industries easier to build a better society. And it's interesting that the subtitle of Peter Davies' book is The Search for Earthly Paradise. So his argument is that arts and crafts architecture was really about the search for earthly paradise. I'll come back to that later on again. I will present to you a number of books, a few of them in Swedish only, I'm afraid, but I'll try to summarize very briefly the arguments. And most of the books, however, are available in English or written in English, so you'll be able to read it if you like. Tore Frängsmyr was a historian of ideas in Sweden, and he wrote a book in the early 1980s called Progress or Decline. He describes two basic ideas of future or utopias in the Western tradition or history of ideas. One is the idea of a constant progress, which is very much what industrialization was about. The other one is the idea of a golden age existing somewhere in history, and the idea that society is in a sort of decline after that golden age. He points out two main utopias. One is the idea of an efficient society, which is very much about what the idea of progress. And the other one is the idea of good life. And he says that the history of ideas of Western society is dominated, utopias are dominated by the ideas of an efficient society, but there is always this alternative thinking about the possible good life. And William Morris is one of the main examples of that sort of interesting good life. He also lists a number of dialectical concepts which are parallel to the idea of efficient society and good life. It's about rationalism versus sensibility. It's about town versus country, state versus individual, elitism versus democracy, and rule over nature versus adaptation to nature. So these come in connection with the ideas of an efficient society or a good life. Another Swedish historian of ideas, Benedict Lidman, wrote a book which is also, as far as I know, only in Swedish in 1997. It's The History of Ideas of Modernity, and his title of the book is In the Shadow of the Future. One of his main arguments is about two sides of enlightenment or modernization in in the 18th century and on, and that's the hard and the soft enlightenment. The hard enlightenment is about science and technology, and thus also about what industrialization was making to society with all its advances and also all its problems. But he also wants to underline that there was always, from the 18th century on, an idea of a soft enlightenment. There were concepts like democracy, French Revolution is part of that idea, of course, and also concepts like culture and aesthetics are coined during the Enlightenment. Aesthetics is from mid 1700s, and culture is a concept that is developed in the modern sense of the world during the 19th century. In that book, Sven-Erik Lidman also has a chapter where he discusses the relation between art and technology, or arts and crafts and technology. And his argument is that in pre-modern times, up till the Renaissance or maybe a bit further, art and craft and technology was basically the same thing. When people talked about art, it was the knowledge of a craft, and the technology was very much about craftsmanship and technology. Then he says, Sven-Erik Lidman, that during the 19th century there is a separation of art and technology, even to the extent that they become opposites to each other. Art is understood as something very soft and not very rational. It's about feelings, and technology, on the other hand, is hard facts and the part of industrialization that you see. And they seem to oppose each other and to be rather strange to each other, or even detesting each other. And then the argument of Sven-Erik Lidman is that today we see a new confluence of art and technology in many ways. Artists use technology, like video artists or graphic designs with the help of computers, and of course authors writing books with the help of a computer, or even giving lectures is about using all the modern technology. At the same time, he says that technology is aestheticized in a sense that it cannot do without art. Even if that is not something completely new, he thinks that this has advanced to a new and higher level than ever before. And he talks about the situation today as a new unified techne concept, and then he uses a concept from the Greek philosophy. According to Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, there are three kinds of knowledge. Techne is what could be translated with craftsmanship. Episteme is what we usually mean by scientific knowledge. And phronesis is wisdom. And that's the way that a society should be ruled or governed. And I think it should be remembered here that the Greek state was a slave state where craftsmen and physical hard work was something for slaves and not for free men. So there is a long tradition of a certain uninterest in the techne maybe, but it's still part of the knowledge. And the goal of all this is something that Aristotle calls eudaimonia, which can be translated with good life or prosperity maybe, or if you like it, with earthly paradise. That's the idea of the whole thing, really. A few words then about the ideas of digitalization. If you want to understand the broader context of digitalization and what it means for society, I think Manuel Castells 3-volume work from 1996 about the information age. The first volume is called The Rise of the Network Society. This is it's a classic work in the field, and it gives really the broader aspects of what digitalization might mean for society. He uses terms like information age or network society to describe what this development is. And in the end, in the last volume, he tries to summarize it by saying that in the network society or in information age, you could say, I think, therefore I produce. Production is not anymore only a physical production, but it's to a very high degree an idea or symbol management, as one concept has it. There are, however, also discussions or problematizations of this development. At the same time, the American sociologist Richard Sennett, who is a very prolific writer, he wrote a book in 1997 called The Craftsman, and his argument is that what you see in modern society is a separation of maker and user, of craftsman and artist, of technique and expression, of practice and theory. And his argument is that this is problematic. It's a threat to the pride in high quality work, which is something very essential. And when he talks about craftsmen in this way, it's not only the handicrafts, even if the front page of the book shows this symbol of the hand as something essential to the craftsman. He's also talking about craftsmen like medical doctors, for example. I don't think he mentions architects very much, but he could certainly have done that. So it's a craft also to be professional, to be able to handle a profession. The motto of Richard Sennett's book is a quotation from the French author François Mauriac, which says, "Travail opium unique." I think you could understand this. Work is a unique opium. It's something that is highly satisfying, maybe a bit risky as well if you overdose it, but another book which I have enjoyed very much reading is the American architect and teacher of architecture Thomas Fisher. He wrote a book in the year 2000 called In the Scheme of Things. He's talking about something he calls space of flow, which I think is very close to the network society, and he sees a new role for the designer, both architects and other kinds of designers in this society, which designers don't seem to be aware of. He says that their great advantage in the space of flows is that they can handle fuzzy problems, which are constantly evolving in this kind of situation. You can't use the traditional way of solving problems. You will always have a very complex situation that you have to handle. I once met Thomas Fisher when this book was very new, and the first thing he told me was that you should know that if there is the word things in the title of a book, it's part of what is called the material turn or the pragmatist turn, which is a phenomenon in the 1990s, as opposed to the linguistic turn, which was this very theoretical and deeply French philosopher influenced ideas, which also were quite common in architecture during the 1980s and early 1990s. Against this, there was a certain emphasis on the practical and the material side of architecture. One magazine that was started by two young women architects in the United States was called Praxis, which tried to deal with this problem. And Ashley Schaefer, one of them, she wrote an article called Theory After Theory, and this is then about after theory is, you can say, the material or pragmatist turn, which comes after the very theoretical linguistic turn. But her argument is, of course, that after theory doesn't mean no theory, it's just another theory. So there is a theory after theory after all. Yet another book in Swedish, as far as I know, not translated yet. It's a fairly recent book by Jonah Boninmark. She's a philosopher, and the translation of the title of the book says The Renaissance of the Unmeasurable. One of her main arguments is that there are two forms of knowledge. She calls them ratio and intellectus, after some medieval philosophers that she has been interested in. And basically it's again the opposition of rational sciences versus the kind of knowledge that you find in humanities, art and religion, which is much more open and not as definitive. Again, it's important to underline that Jonah Boninmark doesn't say that it's either or intellectus instead of ratio, but both and she says that in a situation which she means is very much dominated by the ratio. But she also has some hope for what the book title says, a renaissance of the unmeasurable. So she tries to support that argument. She just published another book which is about that there is always a new horizon. Knowledge is never definitive. It's always, as soon as you come to a certain level of knowledge, you will find that there is much more to know than you thought of before. So knowledge is something that is all the time widening, and it's never finished in any way. So to go back to architecture and to arts and crafts, what can you say that arts and crafts, architecture and design was about? I think I've already been into that, and I think the argument of Peter Davies also that arts and crafts was very much about good life in a situation where the efficient society during industrialization in England was so dominant, and everybody had to try to come to grips with what was happening in society. One reaction was to try to move out from the cities into the countryside and to live what might be understood as a good life. William Morris did that in the way that he had a house built for himself according to his ideas, and with the help of the architect Philip Webb in 1860. This is called the Red House because of the brick that is built on. It looks on the outside very much like a traditional English country house from even medieval times, or 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, with a well on the courtyard to fetch water even. And of course, it could be remembered that what made William Morris able to work with this in this situation as a sort of retreat into the countryside was that he had inherited money from his ancestors, which came from the copper mining industry, and so he was it was really his work was paid for partly by the industrialization, you can say. There is an interesting thing if you look at the plans of the Red House. You will see that they are certainly not the traditional country house model. They are very modern in the sense that they have corridors. It's even written corridor on it. Every room is accessible neutrally from a corridor, which is a typically modern plan. You didn't build like that in the 17th and even in the 18th century. It begins in the 18th century, but it certainly is a modern way of handling this, because it has to do with a new idea of the individual, which also comes with modernity. A book I reread recently, and which also somehow deals with this, is the cultural sociologist Raymond Williams' book Culture and Society, 1780 till 1950. He writes about what I mentioned in the beginning here, how English society, and especially its fiction authors and poets, dealt with the changing society which came with industrialization, and the sort of fight they had to create what they thought could be a culture for a new society. This is not something that comes by itself. The understanding both among conservatives and radicals was that industrialization itself was uncultivated and only thought about money and efficient production, and not about art and the culture. And the ambition, and especially Raymond Williams' ambition, is of course to search for a culture that could be really part of society, not something separated from the economy, but something that involved all society and was understood by all society. So this is the idea of the concept of culture, which is formed during the 19th century by several authors. There was a Swedish version, you can say, of arts and crafts. The artists and the architects of that movement certainly read the English arts and crafts magazine, The Studio. One example is a building here in my hometown, Gothenburg, by the Stockholm architect Carl Westman. It's a museum from 1916. It's a brick building, as you can see, like William Morris' Red House. The Swedish arts and crafts were usually called national romanticism, but it has also been argued that this is a problematic concept because it was neither national nor romantic, so why call it national romanticism? It was not national, for example, in its frequent use of red brick, which had no Swedish tradition. It was actually something coming from England and from Denmark. And it wasn't romantic, it was rather the opposite, very realist, very pragmatic. And especially Carl Westman was a very pragmatic architecture, always built very cost-effective buildings. It has been proposed that maybe you should call it a material realism instead, talking about this material turn and this interest in reality. So if arts and crafts was about the search for earthly paradise, what is the pragmatist turn today about? I think one important aspect of it is to say that it is a critique of the idea of new public management, which is an idea of efficient measurement society, the one which Jonah Boninmark criticizes. Against that is the idea of professional knowledge and the reflective practitioner. For example, discussed in a book by Donald Schoen about how professionals think in action. And among these professionals are also architects, but not only architects, also medical staff, for example, who are really, as you can see to the left, stressed by this new public management ideas. Some other books on this concept. Martha Nussbaum is an American philosopher. She has written several books about basically about what we can learn from Aristotle today. One essay has the interesting title Aristotelian Social Democracy, where she's interested in how to organize good life, and she talks about something she calls architectonic functionings, and these are practical reason or practical wisdom, phronesis, as I talked about earlier, and affiliation, which is about collaboration between people and living in a society and adapting to that. What I'm interested in the work of Martha Nussbaum is her idea about thick, vague conceptions of the good or the good life. A thick, vague conception is a list of aspects of such a good life, which means that you cannot have one quantitative measure which is enough to describe what a good life is about. You have to have a thick, vague list, and the thick list means that it consists of several different aspects of life. And you can't do with just one measurable aspect, but you have to fill it in with several aspects. And vague in this case means that it's open for discussion, it's open for cultural adaptations to different situations. So it's not something definitely specified. This is something that you cannot achieve if you really want to discuss quality questions. I'm a bit fascinated by thick, vague lists, and I think it's a good way of discussing these things. And one example is the Italian author Italo Calvino, who in 1985 wrote 6 memos for the next millennium. It was supposed to be a series of 6 lectures in the United States, but unfortunately he died before finishing the 6th of them, so there exist only 5. As you can see, it's a thick list as well, with quite different aspects: lightness, quickness, exactitude, visibility, multiplicity. And the 6th one was supposed to be consistency. And he is under these, there is a book which is very interesting to read, I think, about this, and he discusses this with examples from literature. So he thinks that all these qualities are essential to make good literature, actually. Another thick, vague list, I think you can argue, is Kenneth Frampton's ideas of a critical regionalism. He calls it 6 points for an architecture of resistance, published also in 1983. Very much criticized at the time, and as far as I understand, Kenneth Frampton somehow a bit retreated from that, but he has returned to the argument, and he thinks it's still valuable to discuss architecture. It's a rather multiple aspects list. He talks about the difference between culture, which is somehow locally grounded, and civilization, which is global. He talks about the avant-garde and what happens to that. He talks about what could be a world culture, and he talks about place form. He talks about culture versus nature, and he talks about the overemphasis of the visual versus the importance of the tactile in architecture. I think you could argue that his idea of a critical regionalism is a sort of new arts and crafts idea, or it has a lot of similarities, and I think the goal is again a sort of earthly paradise. Another book from the same time, which I find very interesting, is the American architect Michael Benedict, who wrote a small pamphlet called For an Architecture of Reality. It was actually a sort of polemics with postmodern architecture as it was as it came about in the United States, especially, maybe with a very superficial architecture. He also presents a thick, vague list, 4 points, one of them divided into 2. Materiality is fairly obvious. It's something that he asked for. Significance is not significance in the postmodern sense, but it is about significance to someone. Architecture is always important to someone who is a user of it. Presence is a tricky concept, but I think you all know what the presence of an actor on the theater scene is about. Is something that somehow makes itself very present, very visible, and without necessarily having any sort of grand gestures, but also working with rather simple means, but nevertheless catching our interest. Emptiness can have at least two different aspects. It is about openness for different ways of using it, but it also has some other quality that is more or less philosophical or part of sort of meditative aspect of emptiness, which you can find in Japanese culture, for example. And emptiness is also something that you can say that nature has. Nature has no intentions with that. It's just is there for us to understand. Visherum Art Hall is an interesting small institution in a fairly remote corner of southern Sweden. For those of you who know Astrid Lindgren's works, much of what she writes about happens not very far from this place, Virserum. There was an artist, Henrik Telemann, who founded this art hall in the early 2000s, and he also had the idea to write a manifesto for an architecture of necessity, which I was involved in writing. And again, we have this thick, vague list. An architecture of necessity should be responsible. It should be diligent, meaning passionate and professional. It should, of course, be sustainable. It should be just, or example of a justice, not unfair or rather egalitarian. And it should be open to new uses and different uses. This list you can also find on the website of the Virserum Art Hall. The symbol for the art hall is the hand, and this goes back to an art installation made by Henrik Telemann, where he made gypsum molds of the hands of workers and put them on pedestals, a lot of them in a large exhibition space. And then he wrote a short story of the life of the worker whose hand you can see on these exhibitions. So you can say that was a celebration of the hand and the craft again. A few architectonic examples, maybe to clarify what this could mean before I end up and open up for a discussion. This is a brick wall made or shown in the Swiss Biennale Pavilion of 2008. It's made by a bricklaying robot, which makes it possible to make these curved forms, of course. And you could ask, of course, if William Morris would have welcomed it. I think he could have done that. And there is an interesting inscription on the wall in Italian, which says that, and if there were no individual authors, what would that mean? As I understand it, this is about the possibility that a digital craft might start to live its own life, so to speak, and maybe not be completely under control of a single individual, a single author of the work. But is that a problem? That's, I think, the question they tried to raise by this installation. Zaha Hadid's works are, of course, world famous, and she has, or her office has been designing large cultural centers like this fairly recent one in China. This is a type of architecture that it's all often connected to digitalization, and I must admit that I have some problems with this. It has been launched as a new style for the digital era, a parametricism, but I think there is something paradoxical in building a large concrete sculpture over something that is supposed to stand for a space of flow and a sort of continuous movement. This is trying to fix that flow rather than to celebrate it, I think, which for me is a very big problem. As opposed to that, I think I would like to say a few words about this fairly unspectacular piece of architecture, which is one of my absolute favorites. We happened to come upon it when it was a very new building, just around 2006. It's a small factory town called Baden, which is ASEA Brown Bovery's factory town, actually not far from Zurich in Switzerland. It's designed by a local office of architects, Burkhard Meyer, of whom I never had heard before when we were shown this building or recommended to visit it, and guided through it by one of the architects of the firm. I think it's a very interesting example of cultural sustainability and an atmospheric density. It's very low key, but it's truly original if you look closer at it in ways that I think could be possibly a part of a DigiCraft. It's a school. It's a training school for the factory town. Actually, the plan is quite original. As you can see, the classrooms are in the center of the building, and the corridors are on the outside of the building. What this gives is a flexibility in the use of classrooms. You can use them as 4 separate rooms, but you can also put them together 2 and 2, and even 4 and 4 together. The corridors on the outside are a sort of filter of sunlight in a glass building, but they are also the ventilation ducts of the building. And since they are very wide, it means that you have a low speed of the air moving there, which also gives less problems with the sound from ventilation. As you can see, the building is different on its upper side, which is the western side of the building, and its bottom side, which is the eastern side. The western side has a much denser pattern of pillars, which also work as a sort of brise-soleil against the heat from the afternoon sun, while the sun in the morning is rather welcome to warm up the building, and you want to let in as much as possible of that. It's very much prefabricated and using a high quality concrete factory which was close to this city. I have been talking to the architects also afterwards, and they say that the kind of level of craftsmanship that you could find in a prefabricated building like this is something that we usually connect with Swiss architecture, and we really lack it in Swedish architecture. But they also say that said that this is even in Switzerland something that is getting more rare and more difficult to keep up. In this case, the office of the architects were in the same city. They could follow the building site more or less every day, and they even had one employee who was responsible for the building site in a way that makes it into a true craftsmanship for an architect to work in a system like this without the big distance between ideas and the building site. This is the entrance hall. Just one interesting detail, the concrete blocks, which has this sinus form you can see to the left, they were painted with a red paint, and then the red paint was washed away, but only on the upper surface, so it deepens sort of the lower parts of the sinus curves of the walls. A very simple craftsman technique which made the prefabricated elements into something different from only prefabricated. And a small detail at last, from a staircase, prefabricated element again, and a sort of vicinity and respect for the hand touching the building, so that a building is really a tactile experience as well as something visual that you see. Okay, so for the last slide then, I have a proposal of such a thick, vague list. It's very preliminary. I would really like to discuss it if it's possible. If we don't have the time today after the lecture, since we started a bit late, you are free to contact me on the mail address you see at the bottom here and ask me questions or come with proposals. I think it would be interesting to go on discussing this, and I think you can recognize many of these ideas in this thick, vague list and the 6 memos I propose for a DigiCraft. Materiality is important. Architecture is, after all, something real. It's not a virtual phenomenon. It stands somewhere on the ground. It's grounded, you can say, in a specific location, which is also very important, and makes architecture to something different from many other design fields. Sustainability is, of course, about adaptation to nature, which is extremely necessary and much more important even today than it was in the 1980s when this discussion of sustainability was started. Or you could say that if politicians had listened to these ideas in the 1980s, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in right now. Diligence is an interesting concept. It's about being passionate and professional and doing the work in the best possible way because you are so interested and so much into this opium of being professional or working hard with what you are doing. Openness or vagueness, if you like, is of course the adaptability of the building to new uses. Its openness for different cultural contexts, and the last point is, again, of course, this earthly paradise which comes back. The idea of what gives us possibility to lead a good life is basically what it is about to be human.